Baby Reindeer is Netflix's latest #1 series. This dark humor is based around the story of a comedian, Donnie, who found himself in the unfortunate situation of being stalked by a mentally ill lady called Martha Scott, who he found out had previously been convicted of stalking. Now, this was based on the inspiring true story by Richard Gadd, who is the writer and the actor who plays Donnie. I've just finished watching this series and I wanted to give you my perspective as an Australian-based therapist, as well as share with you my own story of when I had a stalker in my 20s. Now, if you've been with me here for a while, you would know that this is not my usual video style, but I think that as INFJs, empaths, or highly sensitive people, this is something that we should talk about and learn from. I don't want to share any spoilers of the show with you in this video, but if you have seen it, I don't really want to focus on the storyline that we see happen in episode 4. And if you've seen it, you would know what I mean by episode 4. If you haven't yet watched Baby Reindeer and SA is a trigger for you, then I would recommend that you skip ahead of episode 4 or at least watch it with caution. I think the topic of that other particular storyline is something that deserves its own video, which is just not something that I want to do today. So I shared earlier that Richard Gadd, the writer of this story, and also the actor, the guy that plays Donnie, this is actually based on his own personal story. Now, I couldn't imagine the trauma that he would have felt having to reenact some of those scenes and to relive his experience all over again. I think, firstly, I just want to acknowledge that that is incredibly courageous and brave. It's one thing for SA survivors to share their story and to even tell family members or friends. It's a whole other thing to write a show about it that becomes a #1 Netflix show. And I just want to give all my love to Richard Gadd, because I could imagine that the feeling he could be having right now is a major vulnerability hangover. Even if he has worked on himself and has worked on healing his trauma and gone to therapy, I could still imagine that when this blew up and it's gone viral and it became #1 very quickly, that vulnerability hangover would be incredibly real. What I find interesting about this and why I think it's important for highly sensitive people, for empaths, for gentle souls to reflect on this, is that the whole stalking story started when Martha Scott walked into the pub crying. She was upset, she was disheveled, and Donnie, the bartender, he saw her and he felt this sense of pity towards her. He felt this empathy, he felt this compassion. And he could see that she was a really sad lady, and something tugged at his heart where he wanted to cheer her up and make her feel good about herself. He offered her a cup of tea and he offered her a free Diet Coke on the house. I think sometimes when we are empathetic towards other people, it can come with a lack of boundaries. If we haven't learned healthy boundaries, it's easy for us to push and to cross lines that we never thought we would cross. Now, of course, offering a cup of tea to someone is just the human decency thing to do, right? Like, it's showing kindness, it's being caring towards others. Most people wouldn't start stalking you by offering them a cup of tea. But unfortunately for Donnie, this character, it became an obsession. Donnie became an obsession for Martha Scott, and it started with that cup of tea. And this is very similar to what happened to me when I had my own stalker. And I'm going to share more about that later on in the video, so please stick around to hear that. Sometimes when we do things for others, it actually makes us feel good. And in Donnie's case, he was a victim of previous SA and he had experienced trauma in his life. And so I could imagine that by showing kindness to this lady, it actually probably filled him up and made him feel really good. I don't know if you've heard of the word trauma bonding before, but if you watch the entire storyline, you will see how Donnie with Martha Scott and also the storyline in episode 4 experienced a thing called trauma bonding. Now, trauma bonding is a connection between an abusive person and the individual they abuse. It typically occurs when the abused person begins to develop sympathy or affection for the abuser. This bond can develop over days, weeks, or months. Not everyone who experiences abuse develops a trauma bond. And ignoring the episode 4 storyline and just focusing on Donnie and Martha, he actually talks about how it took him six months to report the stalking that Martha was doing. She became so obsessed with him that she was emailing him hundreds a day. Eventually, she found where he lived and was sitting on the bus stop waiting for him. Once she found his phone number, she was leaving him hours and hours of voice messages every day. And it wasn't until she started bothering other people in his life that he finally went to the police to report it. Unfortunately, I think because of the situation and probably patriarchy and the fact that he was a male asking for help from a woman abuser, it wasn't taken seriously at first. And it wasn't taken seriously until it was discovered that Martha Scott had previously been to jail for stalking other victims, which again mirrors what I went through with a stalker, which I'm going to share about later. Some people might not understand, especially if you haven't been a victim of SA, why the person who's being abused, being stalked, receiving this trauma doesn't report the person. And this is a huge topic within itself, but often what you will find happen is this trauma bond can happen, or like Stockholm syndrome, and you can feel special. It can be incredibly hard to report your abuser, and it's confusing. There's so many confusing and conflicting feelings that can happen for the victim. In this particular case, he felt really sorry for Martha Scott. He recognized that she was a mentally ill woman, that she needed help, and so his empathy, his care for her stopped him from reporting her. Not only that, she doted on him, and he already had such a low self-esteem. He hated himself. But there was this woman who every day would give him praise, would give him love, and it filled up his cup. It made him feel better about himself. And so for him to report that meant he was going to lose having somebody giving him this undivided, unconditional love and attention that he was desperately craving. We then watch Donnie go through the grief of losing Martha at the very end when it's all over, and you know, I'm really trying not to give too many spoilers, so sorry, but there's that grief when it's all over and she is no longer stalking him. There's that real sense of loss of what she meant to him in his life. And again, if you haven't been a victim of that can be really hard to understand or comprehend, which just adds to another layer of shame for survivors to have to heal through. Not only that, he had the guilt of reporting her, knowing that she was mentally ill. But now here's the part that I'm sure you've all been waiting for, which is my own story of stalking. I was very young. I was in my early 20s and I was still studying my bachelor's at uni. And during that time, I got my first job in the field. I worked at this crisis homelessness center. We had a soup kitchen there. It was open every day. Homeless people would come in for coffee, for a chat, for clothing, for a shower, to brush their teeth, to get assistance, to play Scrabble, to play cards, to connect with other people. And there was this particular person that was coming in every day. And just like Donnie, I felt that tug on my heart of caring for this person that I would see come in. Now, this person had schizophrenia, and so every day I would greet this person as I would greet everybody else. So I didn't treat this person any differently than I treated anyone else, but I was very friendly, I was very kind, and I would sit down with them, I would hand them a cup of coffee, and I would ask them how they are. We would play Scrabble and we would have a chat, and they would tell me a bit about their life and their upbringing and who they were as a person. Now I started noticing that this person became one of the first ones at the door before we would open, and they would be waiting and excited for the center to open for the morning. Eventually I noticed this person was carrying a notebook, and they would ask me questions. Now I was young and I was naive, and they would ask me questions about uni and about what I was studying, and I had an arrangement with my boss that sometimes when I had classes I could leave the centre, go to my class, come back and keep working as a full-time worker. And I didn't realise this, but they were paying attention to everything that I was saying and paying attention to every small detail in my life. And they were writing it down. And before I knew it, they had tracked down what my uni schedule looked like. Because when they would ask me, even though I felt uncomfortable in telling them, I also didn't want to offend them or assume the worst, which was my young, naive thinking, my young, idealistic thinking that there's good in the world. This went on for quite a while, and eventually they handed me a book. They wrote me a book and they had stapled it all together, and in this book it described me in a way that made me feel very uncomfortable, and it was unexpected. Until this point I didn't even realize that they were even thinking of me in that way. It was quite an older person, and like I said, I was young and naive. And in this book they described me in this, I'm sure you can guess, way. But not only that, they described the train line that I'd go on every day after work to head home, and just all these small little details about my life. And that's when I also discovered they knew my uni timetable. But the thing is, I felt so bad for them because I knew that they had untreated schizophrenia, and I knew they were mentally ill, and I knew that they didn't mean to do this. But I also began to feel very unsafe going to work. It then got to the point that this person chased me down one of the busiest streets in Melbourne, chasing me and telling me, it's gonna be okay, it's gonna be okay. I'm a priest, I work for the Catholic Church. Now they were schizophrenic and obviously having some type of a psychosis. And so I would go into work and I would hide in my office. And my manager, thank God for my manager, he witnessed this happening, and he said, we need to do something about this. And we began to do research, and we actually found out that I wasn't the first support worker or care worker in the area that had experienced this with this person. And he had actually been kicked out of other service providers for showing the same behaviour to other women staff. And that was one of my biggest issues, because I knew they were homeless and I knew they relied on our service to be fed and to be clean and to have human connection. And I didn't want to be that person who stopped them from coming in. But of course, I had to do my job and I couldn't keep hiding in my office. Now, I just want to make this clear that this stalking period did not happen for the same amount of length that it did for Donnie and Baby Reindeer. And that is because I had a manager who stood by my side and took me through the process of reporting them. And I think because of the position of where I worked and the people I worked with, it was taken quite seriously. Plus, my manager is a well-respected person in the community. Eventually, I had to go to court to get a restraining order for this person. And the part in Baby Reindeer where he tells the police, I just want her to get help, I really related to that, because I remember being in the court stand and I was so nervous being in court. I had no idea what to expect. I remember looking to my manager for an answer, and the judge told me off because I had to answer with my own words and not look to other people. But I remember saying that I don't want this person to get charged or to go to jail. I just want this person to get help. I want them to go to hospital. I want them to get treated. And this person never actually turned up to court, and I never saw them again, and they stopped coming to our service, and there was a restraining order so that they couldn't be within a certain distance of me, which meant while I worked there, they couldn't go there, which made me feel very bad. At the time, I felt so guilty. And I remember my manager said to me, you are acting like you're a DV victim. You are acting he's like, why do you feel sorry for them? They've done this to themselves. And I just could not shake the guilt. But I think this is an important topic for us as INFJs, gentle souls, highly sensitive people. In other previous videos, I mentioned the importance of having healthy boundaries, because I know that back then I did not have healthy boundaries. I had a bleeding heart. I wanted to save the world. I wanted to help everybody. But I did that to the detriment of my own safety, of my own needs. as empaths, we need to take better care of ourselves and place these healthy boundaries in our life. And it's not just for our own safety, but it's for the safety of the other person as well. I'm grateful that I had that experience early on in my career, at my very first job in my career, working with vulnerable people, because it taught me from the get-go that between client and practitioner, I need to have very strong boundaries. And as I moved into working in youth corrections and other work like that, I always had those healthy boundaries. I noticed other staff members wouldn't have that same boundary as I did, which is fine, that's how they wanted to work, but because of my experience, I never wanted to put myself back in that situation again. It was so bad at one point that I couldn't sleep at night in fear that this person would be watching me through my window. And that was scary. It was really scary, and it triggered up a lot of other past traumas, just like it did for Donnie. And so now I have learned how to show kindness and empathy towards others while also protecting my own personal boundaries and my own safety and the safety of my family. As gentle souls, empaths, highly sensitive people, INFJs, I wouldn't be surprised if most of us have gone through trauma of some sort. And generally those who have gone through trauma, it's like a moth being drawn to the light. People who've gone through trauma that haven't healed, it can be like you become kind of like vulnerable for predators to notice that and to target you and to kind of like pick on you, which is what I think happened to me back in my 20s, and which is what happened to Donnie, I believe. It's important that we decide to have the courage to work on our trauma, to find healing, to be willing to face it, to go to therapy. And as you all know, I'm a therapist and I'm open and available for you if you need that, and to just work on all those parts of ourselves. If you can't afford therapy, that's okay. I have a journaling course that you can use. Journaling was a big part of my own healing from trauma, and so I've created a mini series on journaling techniques for healing and transformation, and I will link it in the description for you. But let me know, have you seen Baby Reindeer yet? I feel like there's so much more that we can unpack, especially from episode 4, but I just feel like that's a really big topic and I want to proceed with that with caution. So I thought we'll just start with this video, see how you feel, hear your thoughts, what you thought of the show. I'm keen to learn from you as well.